Hello everyone, these are the natural selection notes for Unit 9. Let's get started with an introduction, reviewing the last stuff and the goals for this unit, or for this lesson. So there's antibiotic resistance by some bacteria having more resistance to certain types of medicine. They will survive the medicine and then reproduce, and then you will have more of these resistant bacteria. So by not taking the right amount of antibiotics or using too many antibiotics, we risk creating stronger, more resistant bacteria over time. On this model here, we can see E. coli swapped from a desktop. So a desk that hasn't been cleaned with antibiotic has lots of different bacteria. A desk that had been cleaned with a certain cleaner has only the one type, which is likely more resistant. So given the opportunities, these more resistant strains will continue to reproduce. So through a selection process, the better adapted ones survive and can continue to reproduce in their environment. There's also artificial selection, where we were able to make dogs from wolves by selecting certain traits like friendliness or different coats or sizes to make the kinds of dogs that we wanted from the wolves. Now, wolves became the way they are through natural selection, not artificial. The ecosystem selected which ones were better off to survive and reproduce. So artificial selection is human-selected process of survival and reproduction. That's how we got dogs and crops and farm animals. Natural selection is where nature picks the ones that will survive and the ones that won't. But for both of them, there's variation, inheritance, selection, and time for this to create changes in the population, for evolution to occur, for new frequencies of traits to appear. Some traits will be more common. So evolution is that change in the frequency of traits. And our goal for today's lesson is to explain how natural selection is going to influence that evolution. Natural selection is a very important main thing we talk about as a cause for evolution, but it actually isn't the only cause. We'll get into the other ones on a different lesson. So we've got this the chameleon and a bunch of different beetles. So in this situation, is there VIST? Is there variation? So there's a variety of different colored beetles. We can assume that these colors are inherited. They're not acquired over their lifetime. If they are acquired, then they don't matter. Is there a selection process? The chameleon is selecting which ones survive and which ones don't by eating some of them. And over time we should expect there to be more green beetles in this group of beetles. A more realistic situation that we have data for, we've got peppered moths. So you can definitely see the darker moth here. This is the lighter moth. It's the same species, but there's variation between the two. By measuring the populations over time, we can see that there were a lot more light moths in the early 1800s, and then during the late 1800s and through the 1900s, there were a lot less of them. So why would that be? Well, during that period, there was also lots of pollution, and the trees actually became darker. So the darker moths actually were better adapted in this situation and better blended into their environment and less likely to die and more likely to pass on their genes. When pollution started to clear up, then their population dropped down, the light moth population went back up. So the frequency of the traits changed over time in the species. A lot of what we know about natural selection we owe to this person, Charles Darwin. There's also another person, Alfred Russel Wallace, who isn't often mentioned, but he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species after he traveled on the Beagle, which is a boat to a bunch of different islands. So he was a naturalist, and he observed lots of different biodiversity. One of the big important places that he went was the Galapagos Islands, here on the coast of South America. There he saw a bunch of different finches, and he noted some ideas, one being descent with modification. There's going to be variations that always occur in nature between different organisms of the same species. But these variations can accumulate into larger changes. So over time, different variations can build together to make larger changes. And the second idea was common descent. So all organisms likely evolved from a previous form. This finch here likely evolved from a different finch that was in South America. And drawing a conclusion from that, he thought that all organisms, to some degree, share common ancestors. So that's how he could explain why all these different finches existed and were so well adapted to the foods that they were eating and likely came from the same ancestral finch. So, some major points that he made about how natural selection works. So in our finch example, we have South American mainland finches were probably blown from South America to that island. So these finches had variations. They had different beaks. Some variations were better for different foods on the island. Some were better for seeds, some were better for bugs. There were more finches than available food, so some of them are not going to survive. The better beaks survived and had offspring with those beaks. So if you were better able to eat with the beak that you had, then you were more likely to survive and have offspring. And number 5, the finch populations will change over time due to these variations. So better adapted beaks will get passed down, and if they change to become even better, then that trait will build on to the previous one, and so forth, as generations occur. So we can summarize it, whether it's finches or not, into these points. All populations will have genetic variations. All variations are not going to be good. Some of the variations will be favorable. More offspring are produced than survive. Not all organisms are going to survive and reproduce, so not all traits are going to get passed down. And these favorable traits that do survive will get passed down. And a population, because of this, will change over time as these variations occur. Let's look at another example. We've got 2 types of worms. We've got night worms and day worms. The birds eat during the day, so they're pretty much going to eat the day worms. Nocturnal worms only come out at night, so they're going to be more likely to survive. So natural selection has selected against the day worms, the diurnal ones, and it has selected for the nocturnal worms. There is variation between the times that they eat. There was a favorable variation of the night worms. Not all of them survived, but most of the ones that did were going to be the night worms. So the ones that had the favorable trait were the night worms, and they're going to pass it down. So I should expect more night worms to occur over time in this specific population. So as long as there's variation, that could be from mutations or sex, as long as there's finite resources limiting the amount of organisms that can survive in an area, and as long as there's changing environments where the variations in the resources that exist are always in flux, we will see natural selection occur. Some organisms will survive. And if they survive, they can increase exponentially. They will reproduce and pass on those alleles. And an accumulation of those alleles can change the species over time. Now you guys are going to have some practice questions, and I hope that was helpful.